Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Dr. Wendel is a behavioral scientist who studies financial behavior and how digital products can help individuals manage their money more effectively. He serves as head of behavioral science at Morningstar, where he leads a team of behavioral scientists and practitioners to conduct original research on saving and investment behavior. Steve has authored 3 books on applied behavioral science, Designing for Behavior Change, Improving Employee Benefits, and Spiritual Design. And he's founded the nonprofit Action Design Network, educating the public on how to apply behavioral research to product development with monthly events in 12 cities. He has 2 wonderful kids who don't care about behavioral science at all. Dr. Wendel, or Steve, let's say, because you sound like a pretty casual guy. Welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Nick.
And I love the little ending line there with 2 wonderful kids who don't care about behavioral science. I have my entire family, I would say, they don't care about behavioral science, my lovely wife included. So
Yes.
It's funny because like we have these conversations and I do this podcast and you do your work and I do my work. And it's like, yeah, my entire world is this. And it is like, it's going to solve all the problems in the world. And then you go downstairs and you talk to your family and you're like, oh, maybe we have a bit of a bias with this this whole behavioral science thing, but we still love it. Yes.
Indeed.
So let's jump right in. And congratulations are in order because your book, or one of them, is actually coming out very shortly. 2nd edition is what's
Yes.
that date so listeners can look out for that?
Yeah,
Is
so
it
actually
end of
the
June?
digital version, the Kindle version, is now out, and we expect the
Good.
paper version any day now. So O'Reilly has it, and Amazon should be selling the paper version shortly.
Oh, very good. Well, congratulations on that 2nd
Thank you.
edition. And so people are wondering, it's Designing for Behavior Change is the one, because I did mention
That's
that
correct.
these are 3 books, but this is the one that has the most up-to-date recent second edition version.
That's right.
So let's get into that a little bit. Is that a good way to start our conversation for you?
Yeah, happy to. A lot of my life for the last I don't know, year has been that in the evenings. I have a day job at Morningstar, and my night job has been writing and talking to folks in the field, which has been quite enjoyable.
Wow. And then a father in between there. So you've been a busy guy, I gather.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
My kids have
So
said, "Oh, are you finally done?" I'm like, "Yes, I'm done.
yeah.
I'm done."
And then the 4th book comes. No, just kidding. So in your book, there is quite a bit of emphasis on, it's behavioral sciences in the title, but there is this emphasis on the combination approach between behavioral science and data science, sort of the 2, marrying and coming together. And that's something that's been coming up more and more, I feel, and it's sort of not surprising. So when it comes to behavioral science and data science for optimizing product and making our products and services as best as possible and making them essential for all the end users, how have you seen that play out in the last few years? Like in the book, it is sort of a balance between the ideal, this is what we should be doing to produce the best outcomes, but what are you seeing out there in the market and out there when you have conversations with these leads and product designers? Is it happening, or do we have still a lot more work to do?
Sure. So in the combination of data science and behavioral science, it's happening slowly. So it's company by company, but Uber, for example, until recently, their behavioral science team was part of the data science team. Allstate, same thing. They continue. A variety of companies have now really combined these efforts. And while there are, for example, other data folks at Morningstar, in many ways, we also combine that on our own team, in my team at Morningstar. Sorry, Nick, 1 second. I had some distracting sounds in the background. Did
No
I
worries.
miss your question entirely, or did I answer it there?
No, you did. You were on the right track for sure.
Okay, good. 1 second. I will go and be in a different
Of
room.
course.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
That's all right. That's happened to me plenty of times.
When we think about the combination of sorry, do you want to riff more on that?
No, yeah, please, yeah,
Okay,
go ahead.
cool. So when you think about the combination of data science and behavioral science, there are, well, traditional behavioral science in academia and I'd say an early application in companies was somewhat limited, right? We looked at how can we have um, a universal impact? How can we move our users to do X, whether X is exercising more, learning a language, buying a product, whatever it might be, right?
Mhm.
And I think thankfully we found some limitations to that. Well, we found them. They were always there. I'm just glad that we
Mhm.
started to find them. Um, and we're starting to look in much more detail at, in the front, what are the real obstacles that people are facing? Not walking in with I want people to do X, and so I will do Y in order to make them do that, right? Which is creepy in the first place. We're now looking in much more detail and using thoughtful data analysis and on the higher end, proper data science to understand, okay, what's actually going on with people and how are people different? How are some people, for example, responding to our application and not others? And at an individual level, not at a simple demographics of men versus women, etc.
Mhm.
And so that's one area it's helping. It's also helping on what we call treatment responsiveness, kind of combining the two to understand where who is this working for and who is it not working for. If we don't find the people who it's not working for, then we're just not looking. And I think
Mhm.
that getting closer to the data, not just looking at our single t-test, our single
Mhm.
experimental result, is a really healthy thing.
Mhm. I couldn't agree more. So, if you'll humor me, this just to continue on this point, let's run a little bit of a thought experiment. So, let's say in an organization, a medium-sized organization, they have a pretty fully built out, say, business unit that is fitted with all the behavioral scientists and a solid behavioral science team,
Sure.
but there's no data science whatsoever. And let's assume, for sake of argument's sake, that the behavioral scientists can, like you said, run a t-test or
Yeah.
maybe even do an ANOVA, if you will.
Whew.
And then, yeah, they're really talented. And then in the other condition or in the other scenario, it's the opposite. So you have a business unit that is totally fitted with all of the smart data analytics and data scientists, but no behavioral science people whatsoever.
Yeah.
What do those two scenarios look like in terms of driving business outcomes? And where would they, I guess, fall short in their own respective way?
Sure. Sure. So I think it some of it comes down to really what behavioral science does and what data science does. And I haven't seen this generally talked about in our industry, but I think about um, data science, at least as generally applied that I've seen, is about understanding and most importantly, predicting. So, how can we build a predictive model of who will exercise more, who will buy our product, who will refer it to others, etc., which is absolutely essential for business value. Behavioral science fundamentally tries to do a different thing, applied behavioral science, which is we're not fundamentally about predicting, we're about changing.
Mm-hmm.
Where prediction is, and I don't mean this to be an ugly word, but it's another form of correlation, right? It is perfectly fine if I can predict that the people that I should be marketing to are those that have this particular characteristic. And by marketing them and not wasting our energies on everybody else, I can build a tremendously effective marketing engine that ethically connects our products with our potential customers.
Mm-hmm.
That's data science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I can predict what are the characteristics of an Airbnb property that will make it really successful, right? Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different than trying to go in the field and saying, okay, I'm just not looking for who's going to exercise. I want to help those who aren't exercising to go exercise.
Mm-hmm.
That is a causal analysis. And so often, again, what I've seen, and so I can only speak to my own mistakes, of which I've made a great many. I can't speak to other people's mistakes, right? In my mistakes, what I've seen is that the data analysis and on the higher end, the data science overall, um, we can get too excited about the relationships in the given context and not think about whether, well, those are going to hold in a different context, whether whether we actually want to change that context and change the profile of who responds. It's a great way of extending from the present into the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we miss theory. We miss, well, what does this really mean? And if I were to try and change the system here, what would happen? Where in behavioral science, We get really excited about the nudge, about the choice architecture, about the habit formation, etc. And we don't really look too much at who we're hurting. We don't really look at whether this mass effect that we're getting is really right for everybody, and how we might, well, get a lot more detailed into people's lives, and whether the intervention that we promote is actually the right thing for the people, right? Right thing where people we're trying to serve. So those are mistakes that I've made, and I believe other people have as well.
Totally. Oh yeah, for sure. And it's interesting, the impression of our field from the outsiders,
Yeah.
the non behavioral scientists who are seeing us and seeing our organizations and our teams sort of pop up um, and some people doing interviews or maybe even listening to podcasts, is that we apply these sort of cutesy little nudges, um, and at most, in terms of their level of technological sophistication, it's a changing of a sentence, or what is my favorite, the slapping on a picture of a fly in the urinal to direct mail stream, if you will.
Yes.
And it's like, that's it? Is that all we have, people? And I think the antidote to that stereotype that's associated with us is data science, is being a little bit more sophisticated in the data we're gathering and the stuff we're modeling, and also the technologies. Like we have these amazing technologies like machine learning and deep learning and AI and these sorts of things. And so I think it's high time that that the two come together.
Agreed.
And
Yeah.
I think you've touched on this point a few times now, just in your response. This notion of heterogeneity and um, dealing with people, your end user, if it's a consumer or a customer, employee, citizen, whatever it is, that people are going to respond differently. We do have, as much as the context matters for moving the needle on behavior, we also have individual preferences. We also have our own personalities and values and goals. And what works for you as an intervention might not work for me. And in fact, it might actually produce an opposite effect where there's a backfire. And I
Exactly.
think there's been a lot of conversation missing around that point. So if you will, can you elaborate a little bit more on how individual differences or and whether it's through data science can help to deal with some of these heterogeneous effects that we see?
Sure. Sure. So, and there are a few, but not nearly enough studies showing this
Mm-hmm.
in a rigorous way, right? I see it in my own work and our own data. But public studies, for example, we see the backfire of peer comparisons, right, and normative statements, where Bashirs and Milkman and others looked at how comparing this was employees at a particular large company to their peers backfired, and they actually contributed less to their retirement savings because they got discouraged. Well, we believe because they got discouraged. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We see this in automatic enrollment and how it may um, hurt people by driving up debt in other areas because they don't make a commensurate change in their expenditures.
Mm-hmm.
And I think human behavior is just horrendously complex. And thank you for it, right? I'm glad that's the case. Otherwise, we'd all be manipulable pieces on a chessboard. Um, but we should expect that what we're doing won't always serve people, and again, might backfire. So I see in many cases we see a mean effect, but then when we start looking in the population, like, oh yeah, okay, some folks this just doesn't seem to be helping at all, right? Or we do see sometimes gender effects, we see age effects, we see income effects, we see lots of different, lots of variations in the population, and we need to start digging into that a lot more, right? And I think part of the challenge is to get beyond the cutesy, right? Part of it is dig into the different needs of folks in a population, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is tackling harder problems, right? So when we're just trying to drive email opens, then yeah, it's actually really small things that seem to have a big effect, right? And it's especially when the prior practice just hasn't been that thoughtful or that careful, then it's remarkably easy to walk in and wave a magic wand and change some things and significantly increase ROI, right? It's when smart people have already tried to attack the problem, and it's difficult. Exercise, weight loss, right? Those are ones that I often think about, or savings behavior. Um, or where we're trying to take on bigger social problems, systemic inequality, racism, mass environmental degradation. These things are much more difficult than email opens. And there is some really exciting work of people pursuing that, but those aren't the loudest voices in our field. The loudest voices are consultants and and some individual practitioners as well within companies, talking about their cool email open techniques, right? Or their nudges in various forms.
And I wonder, just to hold you on that point there,
Yeah.
I think it's just perhaps, and this is totally just me speculating and hypothesizing. I wonder if that's the case because, the line "small changes produce big effects" is just such a compelling business case, and it's
Yeah.
something you can go to the people with the money to get budget and mandate and to do our science in the field in organizations. And as soon as you start talking about these more complex or thorny issues like the ones you mentioned there,
Mhm.
just to name a few, and then it's like, well, it depends, and you kind of have to take a systems approach, and you have to interact, you have to collaborate,
Oh, it
and
sounds
then
like
you've
work.
yeah, exactly, and then you've lost the executive, and they're like, get in my office,
Yeah.
go do your little nudging and come back with ROI.
Yeah.
So do you think that's the reason?
I think it's certainly part of it. And I think part of it is being a bit disingenuous about small changes having big effects. It's absolutely true that small changes from behavioral science can have big effects, right? When you're starting from a low base, it's remarkably easy to improve the foolish mistakes that are in a design, right? That wasn't very good in the first place. That wasn't thought about. But small changes in just about any field is going to have a big effect from that situation. It ain't unique to us, right? Thoughtful
That's
design
true.
that is tested against user needs in a qualitative approach is going to have a big effect, right?
Hmm.
I don't know, sitting and looking at it for a few more minutes and thinking about does any of this make sense? That's going to have a big effect. A lot of our big effects are because people weren't paying attention to the problem in that way. And I think our greatest impact has been to pay attention to the details. I think, frankly, if anybody else paid attention to the details and was empowered to do so, right, that's key, then we'd also have some pretty large effects from small changes. And
Hmm.
you talk to designers who are tremendously thoughtful people who haven't necessarily been empowered to go do that work in these cases. It's not unique to us.
Totally. And
It's
who like
rather we
talk
start
about
measuring it, and that matters. I've known wonderful designers who have suggested the exact same things that I have, but they haven't measured it, in
yes.
part because they haven't been allowed to, right? And it is coming in and saying, look, we need to measure this ROI. That's where we're more unique.
Right.
But then
So it's
again,
not that
sorry.
so it's not that we do it, like it's not that we do it that way. It's how we do it that way, which is measurement, which is science, which is, I guess,
Yes,
to some extent the
that
scientific methodology.
that
And we
matters
came in
immensely.
with that,
Yeah,
right, with the tools and the nomenclature and the frameworks. And every time I talk to somebody, whether it's on the show here um or just in casual conversation, who they don't necessarily have a behavioral science or psychology like sort of training or background, and in
hmm
fact they would have sort of worked in their respective field of, say, marketing or whatever it is, or product
sure,
design. They said, yeah, I was sort of like, fumbling along with the work I did, and then in 2000, between 2010 and 2015, I read a book, and that book allowed me to sort of talk about the work I was doing already, or the things I was thinking about, in a
exactly.
way that was a little bit more systematic. And I think
Yes,
that's what's really
yeah,
helped. Yeah. Good. Good. Oh, one other point to this, while we're on this topic is, fortunately, we are seeing in some of the big organizations, which you mentioned some at the outset of our conversation, the
hmm
Ubers and the Intels and
yeah,
Microsofts, they're equipping in-house behavioral science teams and behavioral
yep.
design teams, which is fantastic. What is your sense? And I don't have a really good sense of this, so I'm curious to hear your thought. What is your sense of what those teams look like, and what that talent pool looks like in the big Fortune 500 organizations versus, say, your more nimble, agile startups in Silicon Valley, your tech startups. Is there that same appetite? And if so, how do those two behavioral science units differ between the two styles of organizations?
So as part of the second edition Designing for Behavior Change, we ran the behavioral team survey, which was I think you participated in,
Mm-hmm.
which was to the best of my knowledge the largest such survey in the field. We had about 40% of known organizations out there who have behavioral teams filling it out, which is great. Um, and what you see, large and small, um, is just a tremendous diversity, right? And I can speak from the interviews I did and just talking to lots of my peers in the field. Um, there are a scattering of PhD folks who come from a formal program, and we see some of those in small companies, right? Newer companies, um, Pattern Health, right? Rally, folks like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have we have a smattering of those in some of the large companies. But many of the folks are, well, they're whatever business domain the team is working on. So if it's in marketing, there are generally some marketers there. If it's in products, it's generally product folks. And I think the standalone behavioral science research team is relatively rare, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead, that's because what do they do? Generally, they help build product, they build marketing, they build HR programs, etc. And those are more naturally housed within those groups. So we found about a third of the employment overall was in external consulting. So that's your Ideas 42, Basara, BIT, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the other two-thirds were distributed across marketing, data science groups, product, and design overall. So they're largely embedded. I don't have really solid data on the difference between small and large, but my experience thus far has been we see the same type of heterogeneity. A few formally trained folks, and then a lot of folks who got into it from a substantive expertise in one of those fields.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if you had to predict, say, moving forward in the next decade, I know there's been a couple pieces from the behavioral scientist and also Sam Salser's sort of what is 2020 of behavioral science or behavioral design. If you had to predict into this decade that we're
Mm-hmm.
in, and what a start 2020 is for us, what do you think? Do you suspect it's going to be more of the um, embedded business units, and those units happen to have some behavioral scientists on staff,
Mm-hmm.
or is it going to be more of the BE Works and the BIT and the Ideas 42, or do you think it'll just maintain the balance that we see currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think standalone teams, I believe, will be outside of the consulting realm, right? Pretty rare, pretty rare. And that's because why should anyone care about behavioral science? To be frank, what they should care about in a business or a nonprofit environment is what does it do for the company? And we hope, what does it do for the end user, right? How does it help build a better product? How does it help build more resonant and ethical marketing that connects with people, right? How does it improve our employee engagement? And those things already have a head of, they already have a chief officer. So why do you need a chief behavioral officer when you already have a marketer, when you already have a product person, et cetera?
Mm-hmm.
That's my sense. There are some companies and organizations for whom the behavioral science is a tool in itself for external purposes. And actually, that was the origin of our team at Morningstar, which was we're an internal research shop in order to publish research. And then it makes sense to have a separate identity, right? If there isn't a large research department already. But for most folks, they're not using it for content marketing, they're not using it for external content. They're using it because they want to solve business problems. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that'll stay that way. I imagine that if if the standalone consulting shops can survive, and I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen, I expect them to be bought out, right?
Yes, and
To
that's
be
already. I
eaten
think
by the
that's already
big
happening.
high name. What's that?
I was sorry. I think that's already sort of beginning to
Yeah.
happen, or there's whispers of that. And do you see that by like your classic strategy consulting firms? Because we see, in fact, I just had Julia Dar on the show, who's the partner for behavioral economics and behavioral science at BCG. So
Oh
just
yeah.
as one example, I know every every big firm has their own unit. So I suspect that'll be probably the case. Yeah, it's it's interesting to see sort of like what's going to happen next. And so a bit of a pivot here, and I think this was mentioned somewhere in the book,
Mhm.
or I don't know why this I pulled this from the deep recesses of my brain. I could be totally making it up, and that's totally fine, right? Hopefully. So just about the idea of sort of shipping product
Mhm.
when it's perfect, when it's perceived to be perfect versus your MVP.
Yeah.
Do you think that behavioral science allows product designers and managers to give us the permission to ship early, and to get around that like obsession with perfection, because that's never really a thing? Do you think
So
that gives us the permission?
yeah, that is a complicated issue. Um, so on the one hand, I think part of applied behavioral science, at least for me, and the fabric of our approach, is that we're wrong. We're always wrong, and it's a question of how to become less wrong over time. How do we face the messiness of the world with a model, with an understanding about human behavior, and then realize that we'll be corrected, right? That there are things we'll get wrong, etc. And so that naturally lends itself to a go out in the field and try it approach, right?
Mhm.
It is, I think it aligns nicely with the lean startup approach of get out there. In the end, it's really your users who matter. It's not how beautiful your theory is or beautiful your product. It's is this actually serving their need? On the other hand, we also know that our memories and our emotions are remarkably unforgiving. That if you burn somebody with a bad product, then they're going to associate that not in a conscious, oh, that was their MVP. Okay, well, I should expect that the next version will be this much better because now they've tested on this audience and yeah, let me give them another shot. And it's like, no, that was a crappy product.
Yeah,
And it hits you before you get to any rationalization about the business model and what they're doing, right?
yeah.
And so I think the middle ground or the way to solve that is be very, very careful about your audiences that you are rolling out your new product to when you are iterating, right? So how do you do small, cheap tests where you're not burning lots of people, right? You
Mhm.
don't do a big launch of something that's, well, really isn't going to satisfy a lot of people. You
Mhm.
instead say, okay, what's my smallest sample size? What's the group that I can test this with and learn with an understanding that I may never be able to sell the product to them in the future because
Mm.
it's not perfect. And so that's where I go.
That's great. And I'm now just thinking about this. This is actually so it might help for some listeners who perhaps might not have a background in behavioral science, but more are
Mhm.
interested in behavioral enthusiasts,
Yeah.
as people call them. Just to maybe tell a story that's happening to me right now as we speak with a client and an app that we're building, and it's sort of in beta testing right now. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts about where this sort of conflict we're experiencing. So what it is
Sure.
without going into too much detail, it's this app that's very much based in what's called experience sampling.
Hmm.
And experience sampling, for those who don't know who are listening in, is a technique or methodology used typically in psychology and social psychology to track people's attitudes or self-reported behaviors in a given time span. Usually, it's 1 week, sometimes 2 weeks, and it follows people closely as opposed to just being a single one-off survey that's used. So we're building an experience sampling methodology and embedding it into a really nice app product that's got all the bells and whistles, and it's a pleasant experience, and it's delightful, and it's gamified, and it's sort of rewarding, all the things that you need in a product, in a behaviorally informed product. As part of that, though, I'm pushing the reliability and the validity of the data and the questions that we're including. And then there's somebody else on the other side who doesn't have a behavioral science background. They're more sort of like a UX designer, and they say there's way too many questions,
Yeah.
that the user will see the sort of the progress bar as they're answering these questions and say, forget this. This
Yeah.
is such a burden to me. I have to go pick up my kids, and they don't pick up the app again, and we've lost
Yeah.
them. So that's I gather, and just talking to other people, that's a sort of a tricky balance, and that's a
Yeah.
common occurrence, I think, when we're designing products
Yeah.
through a lens of behavioral science. So what are your what's your at first blush? What are your thoughts, and what would be a good way out of that through a sort of like a behavioral design or behavioral science approach?
Yeah, I mean, clearly they're not on the call, so they're wrong. You're in the right here. That one's straightforward. But digging a little bit deeper, I think one of the challenges from going from academic behavioral science to applied work is this unfortunate thing of free will that people can choose not to use your product, right? And I often, as I work with the more academically inclined, that is constantly a struggle. I'm like, absolutely, this would be awesome if anybody would ever do it, right?
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
think that's on the one side, right? That's on the perhaps on the designer side. But at the same time, if you're going to launch, if you're trying to gather feedback and you're not getting the data you need for feedback, it is irrelevant whether or not people use it because you're not learning from the experience.
Yep.
And we have to balance those two. What is the smallest set of data that we absolutely need to gather in order to see, hey, is this thing actually working? How do we get a better signal? We should plan for iteration, plan for being wrong and trying to be less wrong over time. And so that's the balance that I try to strike.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. You've really, I just asked that question to confirm my initial position that I
I am
took with
always
this
happy to
individual.
support that.
Yeah, good. We need to look out for each other, right?
Yeah, indeed.
Um, so although we've never actually chatted before as a face to face or screen to screen, if you will,
Which I think has been a loss,
I've
but now we fixed it.
yes, absolutely. I've heard just from people that you're a really good guy, and that you talk quite often about ethical behavior change, and
That's right.
just in our conversation in the last half hour, I believe you've sort of mentioned the word ethics and ethical probably about 5 or 10 times already. So what is your take there when it comes to designing products for end users and our consumers that are ethically sound? And is that a concern for our field as we read about things coming from the big companies like Uber, let's say, but I think they've done a better job as of late, or Facebook and the whole Cambridge Analytica
Yeah,
thing that happened. What do we need to be concerned about when it comes to doing behavior change ethically?
sure. I mean, I don't think we should be concerned as a field. Instead, I think we should realize that we are just like everybody else, right? That designers have been grappling with and thinking quite deeply about the ethical challenges of design far longer than any behavioral scientist has,
Mm-hmm.
because the field is older, right? And that rather, I think about the ethics of behavioral science as really two parts, right? One of which is quite easy and straightforward, and the other which is far trickier. The first part is, look, we do need clear guidelines. We do need to know what's right and what's wrong. And generally, I don't need to tell anybody that. And, I don't need to really tell me. If we sit back and think about it, we can come up with good, thoughtful rules. And there's a great piece actually in the Behavioral Scientist that gives a sample, right? Here's a checklist as you think about it. In Morningstar, we have our own, etc.
Mm-hmm.
That part's generally okay. If we step back, we come up with things like, huh, uh, I probably shouldn't be hurting my users. Um, I should think about whether I'd feel comfortable giving this product, this marketing, whatever, to my mother, right? I probably shouldn't be addicting people, which surprisingly isn't something we've taken to heart very well. Um, Etc. We can come up with that checklist of things. The harder part is actually doing it, right? Not doing it in the grand sense of, yes, I put in place this checklist and we will check to see whether we're doing it. It's rather our own self-deception, right? And I very intentionally use the first person there. It is our ability to fudge things, to feel great about what we're doing, even though, maybe an independent third party might say that we're not following the rules that we set for ourselves. Dan Ariely's book, The Honest Truth of Dishonesty, talks about this very nicely. Kwame Apia's Experiments in Ethics is another great resource in this. And what we find is that our ethical behavior is just as context dependent as bloody anything else out there,
Mm-hmm.
right? The likelihood that we buy a new product, the likelihood that we exercise, all of these things are context dependent, and so is whether we stick to an ethical line. And so I think we've got a tremendous amount of work to do to redesign our environments to keep us on the straight and narrow through social commitments, through bright red lines, through small wins, through feedback loops, etc. Right? Applying behavioral science to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, in a sense, we are all so sure of ourselves and our goodness. And again, I always use the first person here, first person plural, that we don't invest the energy in where we ourselves might be wrong,
Mm-hmm.
where we in the future might make some moral compromises and say, look, I'm just doing this to help my team because we need this job or I'm going to have to fire people. Or I'm just doing this because this is going to open the door with this client and then we'll get this bigger project and we can do some great stuff with them. Yeah, maybe I'm just not so proud of this one, but I'm going to be able to do this great thing. That's what we watch out for. And that's, we're just as human as anyone else.
I think that's exactly it. We're just as human, and like you said, we erroneously believe that just because we have the knowledge of human psychology and behavioral science, that we're somehow immune. But of course, we know that's not the truth, and we know when we're in the context of showing to the decision makers in an organization, whether internally or externally, that what we do is of value. When you're set up and when you're confronted with that high pressure context where maybe your job is on the line or maybe a promotion is on the line,
Yep.
we shouldn't be surprised to hear that we might make some ethically dubious decisions. So I love this idea of applying behavioral science to ourselves. It's almost like we need that third party, almost like an
Yes,
ombuds office to track
exactly.
us. And I know that's what we could also borrow from other fields who have sort of these professional bodies
Yes,
who objectively and in a sort of impartial view will apply analyses and sort of drop in randomly to make sure that we're practicing good hygiene of behavioral science. It sounds like that is something that we need, especially as we scale and especially as we grow across different organizations.
I
Do you
agree.
think it's feasible, or like what does that even look like? For us, can we borrow lessons from other fields, like whether it's design or any other any
Yeah.
other group?
So in some cases, it really depends on what happens to our field, right? I'm of the stance that our field will largely be infused and eaten by lots of other fields, right? Because we provide such great work and do wonderful things for product and design and marketing, et cetera, right? That it usually just doesn't make sense to have a separate body of behavioral scientists unless you're doing consulting work.
Hmm.
Um, or core research. And so for there, it's okay, what is the marketing body? What is the product body? What is the design body? And again, I really look to design as in leading the way here. Really thoughtful folks setting up design reviews. But barring that, right? Barring that it's just not an issue. How do we deal with this now where we are in this distributed way? Some mixed teams, some embedded, etc. Um, yes, it does definitely start with setting those clear rules, right? And then independent review, and it can be independent within the company. You just got to find somebody that doesn't like you. That's key.
Yeah, who's really trying to find
Well, yeah,
your
they've
yes.
got to be hostile to your hypothesis and hostile to your sense of goodness, right?
Yeah,
That's good research. You look for people who strongly disagree. Um,
that's great.
and independent review bodies. So the BSPA has been looking
Hmm.
somewhat at this. I know Action Design has talked with them as well, which is the organization I founded a while back. Um, and I think there's promise there, but it's we've gotten to let's talk about checklists and what is ethical. The everyday like accreditation and review, that's a really hard problem. And
Hmm.
until, at least in my experience, it's only in the face of regulatory pressure. Looking at history of other fields, it's only in the face of regulatory pressure and potential external regulation do groups tend to self-organize because they try to neutralize that regulatory threat. And thankfully, at least in the U.S., we have that regulatory threat. Hallelujah. So, as you may know, in the U.S. at least, and I know somewhat in Europe, I don't know in Canada, there have been moves to much more strictly regulate um, the use of psychological experiments and behavioral science specifically, but not solely, especially in large digital platforms, taking on Facebook, taking on Google, Amazon, etc. Uber, they lost their behavioral science team a while back, but when they were, because there've been some high-profile abuses, and those have gotten political attention. There's a bipartisan bill in the U.S. Congress to ban behavioral experiments above a certain size for companies above a certain size. And I think if that moves forward, and we've got too much else going on politically for it right now, but if that moves forward, then I think that will create the environment where we can organize some effective review. Beyond that, it's just, I think it unlikely.
Yeah, right. I mean, just sort of from a regulatory, like I'm talking, when I say regulatory, I mean like the sort of the psychological cybernetic control mechanism, which is you need something to trigger a desired action, like some bad event or some bad behavior, and that getting the popular press, and then the masses seeing us in a bad way, and we're like, oh shit, we gotta fix this.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden we're motivated to reduce that that discrepancy,
Yeah.
which is exactly what we need. I agree.
Yeah. No, again, not uniquely so, right?
Mhm.
So I talk about these, but I also want to say, look, we're just human and we suffer from the same things. But
Yeah,
perhaps our research can help us do slightly better.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So a little bit about you personally. You sort of have this very interesting background and the work you're doing currently. So you sort of cut across different borders. You are like behavioral finance. You're in product design. You have these books that you've written, and so
Mhm.
you've established this clear thought leadership. And then your academic background and training. So
Mhm.
for listeners, what was your academic training, and how did you move from the academy to practice and to what you do now?
Yeah, sure. So my path is almost entirely useless for people. So, because I came in before there were a lot of these programs. But actually, if folks are interested, just stepping outside of mine, there is a more detailed analysis of the paths other people take and how you get into this field in the book. So, but on my side, I actually PhD political science. So I was a software engineer for many, many years before I went back to do my PhD. I did my PhD in political science under one of the early experimentalists. So field experiments, a guy named Joe Oppenheimer, who
Mhm.
is truly an astounding guy. Um, and as I was doing that, I actually started uh, I was working on the side. I started a small political company, and then I joined as first person at a company called Hello Wallet. And as I was, I think, getting into my fourth year of the PhD, we're building our product at Hello Wallet, and we found that it didn't work. Yeah, it wasn't really helping anybody, and people thought it was pretty obvious because we were trying to help people save and budget for the future. And more or less, they said, "Duh, we know we need to save.
Mhm.
What are you doing here?" Right? And so we turned in failure to behavioral science, right? To say what else is out there. I had the real joy and benefit of learning from John Bashirs, who was then at Stanford,
Mhm.
now at Harvard. Um, John Zinman at Dartmouth, Katie Milkman, and a few others kind of took me under their wing and took me from the experimental political science world into core behavioral science, and that's how I entered. Right, software engineer working at a company, realizing our products weren't working, and at the same time I was doing this PhD and got to learn from some great folks in the field. So sadly, not a path that is probably particularly replicable.
I was
Um,
just, I was thinking,
yeah,
I'm like, I wonder if there's another Steve out there who was a software engineer meets political scientist, PhD meets then behavioral scientist.
of
That is,
course there are.
yeah.
Yeah. So not very useful. But again, in the book, it actually goes through. We do look at how people enter the field and the job prospects and all that stuff. So that's much more useful. My story is just more or less humor.
Entertaining,
Yeah.
no doubt.
So complete happenstance. Complete happenstance is how I got in.
Yes, but I've heard, I hear both stories, which one story is sort of a straight line from starting point to end point, and another is like yours, which might be the most impressive one I've heard, and to some extent like mine as well. It's this meandering path that goes up and down, left and right, back and forth before settling on the current trajectory. But that's a great one. I appreciate you sharing.
My
Um,
my dissertation advisor, Joe, right? He said, why would you want to plan 5 years out? What are you thinking? You have no control over that. Just do the right thing now. It's like, all right, Joe. So
It's a good
He
way to
was
look
a
at
he
it.
was a stockbroker, and he worked in the Navy. He was in the
Huh.
Navy on big ships before he got into political science and became an author and professor. So
Wow.
he spoke from experience.
That is cool. Those are the stories you want to hear. Those are the stories you want to tell your grandkids too, right?
Yeah,
One more question for you, Steve.
yeah,
The BBB, the Big Behavioral Brainstorm, of all the issues that are out there in our world today, if you had to choose one and only one, which one would it be that could stand to benefit from a behavioral science or a psychology or even data science sort of approach?
sure. So I think of kind of two different ways of answering that. One is long-term change. That is our big honkin' blind spot for our field.
Hmm.
Um, we talk a lot about now in the last few years habits. We don't have a fundamental understanding beyond Wendy Wood's work, which is excellent,
Hmm.
of how we do this and where habits are fragile, where they're durable, etc., and how we help change people and not just moments of decision, moments of action. That's one. And if I want to take on a big, hairy problem otherwise, systemic inequality, which thankfully our country, at least in the US, is starting to pay attention to.
Hmm.
And I mean, some people have paid attention to a very long time because of their own experience, but I think more broadly, we're starting to pay attention to in the media, and I hope that lasts. And I hope that as behavioral scientists, we can take on these harder problems.
Hmm. Great. Well, thank you for that amazing response, and thank you for an amazing conversation, Steve. It's been a long time coming, and it's really really great to have you on the show. Much appreciated.
Well, thank you, sir. I'm very happy to be here amongst many wonderful folks you've had in the past. So I'm glad to, and honored to join it.
Cheers. Thanks, Steve. Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.